This is Christopher Sernaque, hosting Episode 2 of Season 3 of the Current Topics in Science podcast. This podcast will address breaking scientific news in light of the origins debate and host interviews with scientists. This podcast is available on the following platforms: iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Video recordings of the podcast will be uploaded to YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Today, on Current Topics in Science, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Jason Lisle. Dr. Lisle is a Christian astrophysicist who writes and speaks on various topics relating to science and the defense of the Christian faith. He graduated summa cum laude from Ohio Wesleyan University, where he double majored in physics and astronomy and minored in mathematics. He then earned a master's degree and a PhD in astrophysics at the University of Colorado. In graduate school, Dr. Lisle specialized in solar astrophysics. While there, Dr. Lisle used the SOHO spacecraft to investigate motions on the surface of the sun, as well as solar magnetism and subsurface weather. His thesis was entitled "Probing the Dynamics of Solar Supergranulation and Its Interaction with Magnetism." Dr. Lisle specialized in solar astrophysics and has made a number of scientific discoveries regarding the solar photosphere, including the detection of giant cell boundaries. He's also authored numerous papers in both secular and creationist literature, being the author of several books, such as The Physics of Einstein, The Introduction to Logic, and The Ultimate Proof of Creation. He's also the host of several presentations such as Cosmology, Evolutionary Model and Problems, and The Secret Code of Creation. Dr. Lisle has worked at Answers in Genesis, the Institute for Creation Research, and he is the founder of the Biblical Science Institute and host of the Discerning Truth webcast. Now, without further ado, good morning, Dr. Lisle. How was your day, and how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Always a pleasure to have you on, Dr. Lisle.
Thank you.
So in this interview, we're going to be exploring mathematics and the divine. Now, before we do that, Dr. Lisle, you minored in mathematics, so I'm wondering, would you happen to have a favorite or a lucky number?
Well, I don't believe in luck. I believe in providence, but I'm not sure I have a favorite number. There's Euler's constant. I'm fairly fond of that one, I guess, because it comes up all the time in calculus and in physics. I have a favorite equation, and that's sometimes called God's equation. It's the Euler's equation, which is e to the I pi equals -1. And that relates four fundamental constants in a way that no one was expecting. And so it's sometimes thought of as a proof of God, but it's a neat little formula.
That is pretty incredible, and I hope to hear more about those kinds of things as we go along together. That was really interesting. Now, since this is Current Topics in Science, we're going to take a look at this week's current topic. Dr. Lisle, Bill Nye, the science guy, he came to the University of Florida, and he gave a public lecture. Eric Hovind, the president of Creation Today, he asked Bill Nye about why the exponentially growing human population is only 7 billion in 2013 if human beings evolved 2.8 million years ago. Eric Hovind summarized Bill Nye's response to him was that Nye said that Hovind needed to study math. So Dr. Lisle, on Facebook, you commented on the situation saying, "Okay, Bill, using your numbers, 3 billion people in 1964 and 7 billion people in 2013 at an exponential growth rate," and then you gave a few equations. Now, for our podcast listeners, I'm just going to read it as it is in text without using any of the mathematical terminology. That way, if they want to type this out on their computer, they can. You have y equal sign, capital A, lowercase e, squared symbol, lowercase r and t. And you said where A equal sign 5.34577.8, capital E, dash 6, and R equals 0.017 29179. Then you said the human population would go back to 2 people in the year 742. Yeah, that's AD. We know that infant mortality rates were higher in the past, so that will push the date back another 3,000 years. But where is Bill getting 30,000 years? Could it be that Bill is relying on some other source of information that he believes to be more trustworthy than science and math? Dr. Lisle, can you expound upon the numbers that you mentioned in the equations that you presented to Bill, and explain why these population numbers pose a problem for the evolutionary theory?
Sure. So anytime you have something that's reproducing, whether it's bacteria, plants, or human beings, the number of offspring tends to be proportional to the number of progenitors, the number of parents. So if you have 2 people and they have 2 kids, you have a total of 4 now. But if you had 200 people and each of them, is a couple, and they have 2 kids each, you have a much larger number in the offspring. And whenever that happens, whenever you have that situation where the increase is proportional to the number, that's called a first order linear differential equation. And the solution to that is an exponential formula. It's basically y equals a times e to the power of rt, where a is some constant, r is some constant to be determined, t is the time, and e is that number that I mentioned earlier, Euler's constant, which is 2.718 whatever. It's an irrational number. It goes on forever in its decimal expansion. And all you have to do, whenever you have that exponential growth, to figure out the other 2 numbers, to figure out the a and the r, the a is kind of relates to the initial number, and then r is kind of the growth rate. To figure those out, all you need is two data points. So you need to know for this example, you need to know the population today, and you need to know the population at some other time. And I used Bill Nye's numbers, and I solved it. And it turns out that if you run that equation backwards to the year 742, then that goes back to 2 people at that point. Now, of course, human beings have been around a little longer than that, although not a whole lot longer than that. But and that's because things like the infant mortality rate was greater in the past, and so people do live longer today than they did during, for example, the Middle Ages. And so if you compensate for that, you can get it back to about 4,500 years ago. Why 4,500 years ago rather than 6,000? Because the flood was 4,500 years ago, and people had to start over at that point. But the interesting thing about an exponential growth like that, where it's y equals a times e to some power, is it gets really big really fast. And so if you push the date of human beings much back beyond the biblical date, the numbers for how many people there should be on Earth today are absurd. Now, Bill Nye was using the number 30,000 years for humanity. And I was going to give you the number, but I put it in my calculator. It's more than a calculator can handle. Just put it that way. And which means it's more than the number of atoms in the universe. So if human beings had been around for 30,000 years, there would be more of them today than there are atoms in the universe, because that's a number my calculator will hold. So I don't know how much greater, because it exploded when I tried to put it in. But exponential growths are like that. And granted, people say, yes, but the birth rate was less in the past. I understand that. But unless it's pretty much exactly zero, exponential growth gets very big, very fast. And so that really limits the age of the Earth to much less than the secularists would like to believe. You certainly can't get millions of years out of humanity, let alone 30,000. We go back a few thousand years, and that's all.
That is incredible, Dr. Lisle. So as stated in question 1, in this interview, we're going to be looking at mathematics and the divine, and those numbers were deeply fascinating. But now I'd like to ask you about Ronald Nash's famous argument from numbers. Ronald Nash, he's a philosophy professor at the Reformed Theological Seminary. He liked to pose this argument to his students. And the quotation that I'm about to read is a bit lengthy, but it is very interesting nonetheless. He says, "When I used to teach philosophy to undergraduate college students, I'd sometimes ask them to tell me what the number 1 is. They would usually reply by writing some of the many symbols we use, such as 1 or the Roman numeral for 1. I would then explain that such symbols are not really the number we are seeking, but only convenient ways we use to refer to the real number 1. No wise person should ever confuse a symbol for something with the thing itself. So what then is the number one? The first step is to recognize that the number one is a concept. What is a concept? The short answer is that it's an idea. The next step to ask is where the concept of oneness exists. The idea of oneness, like all ideas, exists in minds. The third step is to note that the number one is eternal. If someone has trouble with this claim, ask when the number one began to exist. So not only has the number one always existed, it's impossible for the number one ever to change. If the number one were ever changed, it ceased to be the number one. After all, if the idea of oneness changed, let's say into the number two, then it would no longer be the number one. So where are we? I believe we can show many people that the concept of oneness is an eternal and unchanging idea that exists in some mind. And the only kind of mind in which this eternal and unchanging idea could exist must be an eternal and unchanging mind. When I reach this point in my little example, some student in the back of the classroom usually raises his hand and asks if I'm talking about God. Dr. Lisle, what do you think of Professor Nash's argument? Can it be improved in any way? And where do you see it being used in the Christian's apologetic?
I think it's a good argument. I might word it slightly differently, but I think he's spot on. Numbers have those characteristics. They are conceptual. They exist in a mind. They are eternal, which means they can't just exist in the human mind. He said something about it has to be an eternal mind. Well, it has to originate in an eternal mind. We can conceptualize the number one, but it didn't begin with us. So we're borrowing God's thoughts. When we think about the number one, we're thinking God's thoughts after him, as Johannes Kepler put it. That's when we do science, we're thinking God's thoughts after him. So yeah, I would agree with that. The number one, it doesn't change. It's eternal. It's an eternal concept. It has to exist in an eternal mind, and it has to be a mind that doesn't change. Can't be, human mind. We change our mind all the time. We believe things at some point, and then we switch and believe something else based on new evidence. God's not like that. His mind is eternal and unchanging because he's beyond time. He created it. I would probably invert the argument and start with God and point out how the Christian God makes sense of numbers like the number one. Yes, it is a concept. You can write down a representation of one, a numeral. That's not the number one. That's a numeral. Because if I erase that, I haven't erased one. I haven't erased. It's not like people will have to start with two now when they count. I'm erasing a symbol that represents a concept of a quantity of something that has no others like it. That would be the concept of oneness. It is conceptual. It comes from the mind of God. And so I would argue that the Christian worldview, and only the Christian worldview, can make sense of numbers, mathematics, along with other things we take for granted, science, morality, and so on. So that would be one illustration of the fact that the Christian worldview makes sense of those things we take for granted, like mathematics, laws of mathematics. When God thinks about numbers, that's what he's doing. He's thinking about mathematics is the way God thinks about numbers, basically. It's the logic of numbers. And that makes sense in the Christian worldview. And I would argue there's no other worldview that can make sense of that. Certainly not an atheistic worldview where there's no God, because they don't have eternal minds. In an atheistic worldview, they can't make sense of numbers. And you say, what about some other God? Well, it has to be the Christian God. It has to be a God who's eternal, who's beyond time, who doesn't change, who's revealed himself to us in the Bible so that we know that he has these characteristics. And that really reduces it down to the Christian God. So it really is, if you understand it, mathematics, the existence of mathematics and its properties really are a proof of the Christian worldview.
That is incredible, Dr. Lisle. Thank you so much for that feedback on Professor Nash's argument from numbers. It's amazing how it sounds like you're saying that without the Christian worldview, yes, we can still obviously do math, but it wouldn't make sense to do it in any other worldview. Am I hearing you correctly?
That's right. You can still count, even if you don't believe in the Christian worldview, but you can't account for counting apart from the Christian worldview. So, and the reason that unbelievers are able to do things like mathematics is because they're made in the image of God too. And so they're able to think God's thoughts after him, at least in a limited fashion. Just they don't give God glory for that. That's what Romans 1 says. We all know God, but most people are not thankful, and they They change the glory of God into a lie. They worship the creature rather than the creator. But yes, mathematics only makes sense in a Christian worldview. Doesn't mean you have to profess to believe in God to do math, although you should. But it means that you can't make sense of mathematics apart from the Christian God.
Dr. Lisle, thank you so much for that excellent feedback on Professor Nash's argument from numbers. I really appreciated how you highlighted and underscored some of, and even rephrased some of his key points. And speaking of feedback, Creation Ministries International author Sean Doyle had some comments on Nash's argument. Sean summarized the argument in 8 points. Numbers exist. Numbers are ideas. Ideas are grounded in minds. Numbers are eternal and necessary. Therefore, numbers can only be grounded in an eternal and necessary mind. An eternal and necessary mind describes God. Therefore, numbers are grounded in God, and therefore, God exists. Sean had some critiques of this argument. So once again, this is going to be another lengthy excerpt, but I would like to read it to the audience, that way they can be exposed to some of the feedback that they might get if they try to use Nash's argument. So Sean wrote, "One may wonder if there is another mind that could be eternal and necessary, but then one could add in some greatness considerations to say that numbers must be grounded not just in any eternal and necessary mind, but in the sole eternal and necessary mind that grounds all other being. At any rate, I personally have for some time been rather unhappy with this argument. I'm not sure that, 1, numbers are ideas that are constituents of minds, and 2, I'm not sure there are mathematical objects. Regarding the first point, I don't think that even God's idea of the number 1 is identical to the number 1. After all, it's his idea of the number 1. He's thinking about the number 1. Thus, if God is thinking about the number 1, he's thinking about something other than his idea of the number 1. Therefore, his idea of the number 1 can't be identical to the number 1. Regarding the second point, it seems to me that numbers are just a way people refer to quantity. Even if they're linguistically indispensable, that doesn't mean that numbers are metaphysically real objects. For instance, if I say, there's a hole in my shirt, that doesn't imply that the hole is something. It's rather that there's an absence of material. While we can make truth claims with mathematics, I don't think truth claims like 2 + 2 = 4 imply that, for example, 2 and 4 are metaphysically real objects. But if they're not, then clearly we can't argue from their existence to God's existence. Nonetheless, I think that, for example, mathematical and logical truths reflect God's mental nature. I just don't know how to construct an argument for God along those lines if numbers are not metaphysically real objects. Dr. Lisle, what do you think of Sean's commentary on Professor Nash's argument, and how can Professor Nash's points be refined in light of the feedback from Sean?
Well, first of all, I think his summary of Nash's argument is pretty reasonable. Again, my argument might be a little nuanced. It might be slightly different from that, but that's a fine summary. I would disagree with Sean's criticism of the argument, and let's just take this one at a time. He's talking about one may wonder if there's another mind that could be eternal and necessary. Well, and I think he's taking that as a hypothetical. Obviously, in the Christian worldview, no, there's only one eternal necessary mind, and that's the mind of God, the eternal Yahweh, the creator of the universe. So in the Christian worldview, there's no one else like God. He alone he's the father of eternity. He alone is eternal, and he grants eternal life to us, but we have only life in the future. God's beyond time completely. But perhaps he's thinking of it hypothetically. If I'm talking to a critic, can a critic propose some other God that could make sense of numbers? And I think that's a legitimate concern. And having thought about that for decades, I think the answer is no. There's no other God that will do that. It's only the Christian God. Why is that? Well, the Christian God is beyond time. He's eternal. He's thoughtful. He's revealed himself to us, so we know that he has these characteristics. Are there any other gods that qualify in that category? It can't be any of the polytheistic religions, right? Because which God's thinking would represent numbers? Maybe 2 + 2 = 4 to Hera, but maybe 2 + 2 = 5 to Zeus. You see, so if you have a polytheistic religion, that's not going to explain why mathematics is the same everywhere, why it has this universal property to it. And frankly, the Greek gods often changed their mind. They were very human-like, really. They would change their mind on things. That's not going to work because numbers don't change. It has to be an eternal God. It has to be the God of the Bible, basically. And somebody might say, well, I'm going to make up a God that's like the biblical God that accounts for numbers, and that refutes itself because a made-up God can't account for anything, right? I mean, if something's fictional, it can't make sense of anything. And so now he might say, okay, I affirm that there is in fact a real God. It's just not the biblical God. Well, then you got a problem because if it differs from the biblical God, if this other God is not eternal, then he can't account for numbers. If he changes his mind, he can't account for numbers. So the person says, okay, this other God is identical in every way. He's exactly like the Christian God. Well, then he is the Christian God. if he's exactly like the Christian God, he is the Christian God. He says, okay, he's like the Christian God in every way, except he didn't write the Bible. Well, now you got a problem because how do you know what that God is like? You say, well, how do you know what Yahweh's like? Because he wrote the Bible. He told me about himself. But if you have this other God who hasn't revealed himself, you can't know anything about him. And therefore, you can't justify the existence of numbers. Now, that's a brief summary, but that's basically why it has to be the Christian God to make sense of laws of mathematics. Now, then Sean says that he doubts that, he's not sure that numbers are ideas or the constituents of the mind, that they're concepts. Well, actually, the dictionary definition of numbers is concepts of quantity. So they are conceptual. They are ideas of the mind. And if you think about it, well, yeah, that's what they would have to be. You think about numbers. You don't trip over them. You don't pull out a number from the refrigerator and swallow it. They're not material. They're immaterial conceptions. They do exist in the mind. So I think just by the definition of a number, we can pretty well refute that. They are conceptual. Not that all dictionaries have that definition, but that's the best one I've been able to find in a dictionary, is that numbers are a concept of quantity. And so when you think about how much of something there is, that's what you're thinking about. You're thinking about numbers. They are an abstraction. You can have 2 oranges, you can have 2 apples, you can have 2 bananas, you can have 2 planets. What do those things have in common? Two-ness. And that's not something that you can touch. It's conceptual and it's meaningful. So numbers, they are ideas. Then he makes an argument about God's idea of the number 1 is not the same as the number 1. I would agree with that, but not perhaps for the reason that Sean thinks. That doesn't disprove the idea that numbers are conceptual. And the fact that you can have a concept of a concept, and that concept of the concept is not the same as the concept. That's an iterated belief. Okay, and I know that's getting a little abstract, but a horse is not the same as the idea of a horse. And I can think about the idea of a horse, and that's different still, isn't it? I have an idea of an idea. The fact that I can talk about the thinking about the number 1, that I can have a concept of a concept, does not disprove the fact that 1 is a concept. And so, yes, you can have concepts of concepts, but that doesn't disprove the original concept is conceptual. So, and he talks about, is it metaphysically real? And here's the thing, I think, where we have to be careful. All of us who have had any kind of training in academia, for the most part, have been biased towards materialism, because most universities are secular, and even a lot of Christian universities compromise, and there's a lot of secularism in today's world. And one of the, maybe not a tenet of secularism, but one idea that's very common in secularism is that anything that's real is material. It has to be made of atoms or energy. It has to have a location in space. And we tend to think of that as real. Real is physical. But I would argue real is not the same thing as physical. God is real. He's not physical. He's not made up of atoms. He doesn't have a location in space, but he's very real. He's metaphysically real. And I would argue that ideas are metaphysically real. They exist. If they didn't exist, then how could we talk about them, right? They do exist. They are real metaphysically. They're not physical. They're not made of atoms. That's certainly true. They don't have a location. Ideas don't have a location in space. Numbers don't have a location in space. They're not made of atoms. You can't trip over a number or stub your toe on one or pull one out of the refrigerator or accidentally swallow a number. They are conceptual, but they are real. And the fact that you have these real concepts that, in fact, the universe obeys, which is even more remarkable. Maybe that's something we can come back to. But the fact that you have these numbers that exist and have these properties, I think, is a very clear demonstration of the biblical God.
That is incredible, Dr. Lisle. And so now that we've finished looking at a lot of those abstract ideas about and criticisms of Professor Nash's argument from numbers, I want to take another look at an argument from design. It's the usefulness of math in science. Sean Doyle, in an article called Philosophical Arguments for God, he wrote, "The usefulness of math in science is something we discovered. We didn't invent it. Nature really is written in the language of math regardless of us. But if mathematical objects can't explain it and we can't explain it and it's not a coincidence, then why is nature written in the language of math? A transcendent mind. In other words, God." We can summarize the argument like this. If God does not exist, the applicability of math to the physical world is just a coincidence. The applicability of math to the physical world is not just a coincidence. And 3, therefore, God exists. Dr. Lisle, what do you think of this argument for God from the usefulness of math? Is this argument both valid and sound?
I think it is. Yeah, I would agree with Sean on this one. It is valid and sound. Now, of course, the premises, the way that they've been laid out there, someone might not immediately be convinced of those premises. You might have to further defend them. But I think both of those premises are true, and I think the conclusion does follow from them, and not just a God that exists, but rather the God of the Bible, because it's only the God of the Bible that can make sense of the applicability of mathematics to the physical universe. And that is something that is really profound. It's something that all scientists accept. You couldn't do science without that. And yet very few people have given thought to why is it that the physical universe, which is made of atoms, obeys math, which exists in the mind. That's remarkable. And I would argue the Christian worldview makes sense of that, because according to the Christian worldview, the mind of God upholds the physical universe. God is controlling this physical reality. And that's why electrons orbit in the way that they do. They obey mathematical laws because God thinks about numbers in a way that we would call mathematics. And therefore, the way he controls the universe would be mathematical. So in the Christian worldview, it is inevitable that the physical universe would obey math. It has to be that way because God thinks in math and it's God's mind that upholds creation. And we can discover truths in mathematics and in the physical universe because we're made in God's image. And we have a limited capacity to think his thoughts after him. And so we can discover these things in the universe. And so it makes sense in the Christian worldview. But in any other worldview, how do you make sense of the fact that the physical universe obeys mathematical laws? Now, some people would say, well, math is just us looking at the way the universe behaves and describing that. But that's not really true to the history of mathematics. There are certain mathematical truths that were discovered before they have any application to the physical universe. And there are mathematical truths that have no application to the physical universe. For example, one of the things that I thought was fascinating in calculus is when we started doing higher dimensional stuff. And you can use calculus to prove what the volume of a sphere is, that it's 4/3 pi r cubed. But what if spheres were 4-dimensional? What if they, instead of just being 3-dimensional X, Y, Z, what if they were X, Y, Z, and A? Now what would the volume of that shape be? All points that are equidistant from one point in a given dimension, what would its hypervolume be? Because it's like a 4-dimensional equivalent of volume. You can use calculus to discover what that answer is, which is amazing. And the thing is, that doesn't apply to the universe because our universe has only 3 dimensions of space, as far as we know. But in calculus, you can work in 10 dimensions, 20 dimensions. You can work in what's called Hilbert space, which has infinite number of dimensions. So that goes beyond, mathematics goes beyond the physical universe and therefore cannot be merely a description of the physical universe. There are certain things, think about things like triangles. Is there a perfect triangle anywhere in the physical universe? Well, no, because a mathematical triangle is comprised of 3 perfect line segments. But in the physical universe, you get down to the level of atoms, and they're little spheres, and they don't line up perfectly. You don't have a perfect triangle anywhere in nature, and yet we still have the concept of a perfect triangle. So it's not something that is simply derived from our observations of nature. And I would argue that secularists cannot explain, therefore, why it is that the physical universe obeys mathematical laws the Christian can. And lest anybody think I'm making this up, they should look at an article written by a Nobel Prize winning physicist, Eugene Wigner, brilliant guy, but from what I can tell, probably not a Christian, because he attempted to tackle this question of why is it that the physical universe obeys mathematical laws? And he wrote an article, and the article is called "The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences," or something to that effect. The unreasonable effectiveness, because from a secular point of view, why should the universe obey math? And his conclusion in the article, I should have written this down, but it's something to the effect of the miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics to the application of the physical sciences is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. That's his conclusion, is that he doesn't have an answer. And that's very honest of him. And this is no slouch. This is a Nobel Prize winning PhD physicist who had given considerable thought to this question from not a Christian point of view. And so there's no answer from a non-Christian point of view. There's no answer to that. The applicability of the language of mathematics to the physical universe, it's something that makes sense in the Christian worldview and doesn't make sense in any other worldview.
Oh, Dr. Lisle, that was actually mind-boggling. That's incredible. So the usefulness of mathematics only makes sense in the Christian worldview. And that actually reminds me of an article on CMI again. It's from Catherine Loop. Loop said, God didn't just create math, he also holds it together. Yet math only works because the universe operates in a regular, precise manner. One of anything plus one of anything else always equals two. There aren't any exceptions. The Bible tells us that God is the one who, day after day, continues to hold this universe together. Math only continues to operate consistently because God never changes. Objects always interact the same way because God is still holding those objects together in the same manner as he has since the beginning of time. Math's very ability to work is a testimony to God's faithfulness. Dr. Lisle, I was never taught that mathematics brings God glory. And I know that many listening were not taught that either. So naturally, people might be skeptical and they might be inclined to ask, how can one be certain that math works because the God of the Bible exists? Dr. Lisle, what would be your answer to that question?
Well, I would argue that only the Christian God can make sense of the existence and properties of numbers and mathematical laws that relate these numbers to each other. Namely, the biblical God he's infinite, and so we can have things like infinity in mathematics because God's knowledge is infinite, his mind is infinite. God's mind is eternal, and so laws of mathematics have always existed and will always exist. We discover them, but we didn't create them. If we created them, we could have created them different. We could have said, you know what, let's let 2 + 2 = 7. That's not going to work. An architect trying that is not going to do very well in his career. We discover laws of mathematics. So they don't come from our mind. Our mind can learn them. But they don't come from our mind. They come from the mind of God. They don't change with time because God doesn't change with time. God says that he does not change. Therefore, you sons of Jacob are not consumed. That's something that God himself claims to be. Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. They work everywhere because God is sovereign over the entire universe. God is omnipresent, meaning his power is immediately available everywhere. He upholds the entire universe by the word of his power. So the reason that those atoms in the Andromeda Galaxy obey the same mathematical laws and physical laws as those here on Earth, because the same God is upholding that universe as upholding the Earth. And so it makes sense. And, all astronomers assume that, but I would argue it's only the Christian God that can make sense of that. And going back to what you said earlier, too, it really is a shame because I was like you. I was never taught this in school. But then again, I went to a public school. And this is something that Christians need to keep in mind. This is a little off topic, but it's something that Christians need to keep in mind. People a lot of times have the impression that public schools are neutral, that they're neither for God nor against God. The Bible says you can't be neutral, really. You're presenting a worldview to somebody. When you teach them about mathematics, the way you teach it to them will depend on your worldview. And granted, there are a lot of fine Christians in public education, but they have restraints on what they're allowed to say in those schools, unfortunately. But, if I were to teach someone mathematics, I would start from the beginning and I would say, hey, let's talk about what numbers are, why they exist. They exist because God does. They exist in the mind of God, why they work the way that they do. And so when you're studying mathematics, you're actually, in a way, you're studying theology, because you're studying the way God thinks about numbers. And that's awesome to think about that. And I think a lot of kids, if they started mathematics with that conception of it, then rather than mathematics being, oh, this thing that's hard, that's boring, that we'll never use, they'd be like, wait a minute, I'm learning something about God. I'm learning something about the mind of God. And that's awesome. And if it's hard to understand, yeah, that tells us something about God's mind. His mind is infinite.
Well, Dr. Lisle, that was absolutely amazing. And I really liked your comments at the end about how if we truly started with God at the forefront of everything we do, not only will that make everything exciting, more motivating, but that's going to even help draw us closer to him in a way, because we'll be humbled because we learn just how amazing he really is. And that reminds me, there's an article, speaking of God and all things amazing, there's an article on CMI called Golden Numbers. We got golden streets in heaven, but there are also golden numbers. Dr. Wieland and Russell Grigg, they co-authored this paper. It was called the so-called golden section, or golden ratio. They said known to most artists and architects is related to Fibonacci patterns. Most people, if asked to choose from a series of rectangles, the one most pleasing to the eye, will choose one in which the ratio of the two sides, that is, the larger side divided by the smaller, is approximately 1.62.4. So, in other words, the long side is 1.62 times the length of the shorter. This proportion is widely found in art and architecture. Statistical experiments have shown that people involuntarily give preference to proportions that approximate to the golden section. Dr. Lisle, why is it that the human mind is drawn to these numbers? And we're going to cover something that you already went over, but was math something that humans invented? Was it built into us by God? Or is there another solution to this equation?
Yeah, so there is this golden ratio, and it's an irrational number. It's 1.618 something. It goes on forever. The decimal expression goes on forever. If you want to calculate it, I think it's, if you put in your calculator, 1 plus the square root of 5 divided by 2. That's the golden ratio. And it has some interesting mathematical properties to it. For one, the reciprocal of that ratio is the same as the ratio minus 1. So in other words, the golden ratio, 1.618, whatever, you take the reciprocal of it, it's 0.618, whatever. It's the same decimal sequence minus 1. It's the only positive number for which that is the case. And it is true that when people are exposed to rectangles of different aspect ratios, the long side compared to the short side, they tend to prefer rectangles that have that ratio. Now, why is that? Well, I would argue it has something to do with the fact that we're made in the image of God. And so there are certain mathematical relationships that even unconsciously we somehow are able to perceive that. I mean, I can't give much more than that, other than the fact that we're made in the image of God. It makes sense that we would have certain preferences in nature that would be mathematical. And the other thing about the golden ratio too is it's something that when you have the Fibonacci sequence, you mentioned that previously, the Fibonacci sequence is very easy. You start with 0, then 1, and then you add the next number is the addition of the previous two numbers. So 0 plus 1 would be 1. 1 plus 1 would be 2. 2 plus 1, 3. 5, 8, 13, and so on. So it gets really big, really fast. And as the Fibonacci sequence grows larger and larger, it turns out that when you go really deep into the Fibonacci sequence, and you divide one number by the previous one, it's the golden ratio. It gets closer and closer to the golden ratio as you continue on, or as math students would say, in the limit of infinity, or as the Fibonacci sequence approaches infinity, the n plus 1 number divided by the n number approaches the golden ratio. So it's really very interesting, and you'll find it in nature too, like the way a sunflower, the kernels in a sunflower are arranged. They follow the Fibonacci sequence. And when you plot rectangles along the Fibonacci sequence, it creates this lovely spiral. It's very aesthetically pleasing. And so, again, we see mathematics, the fact that there is mathematics, a demonstration of God, the fact that things in nature obey these mathematical relationships like the Fibonacci sequence. Amazing. And it makes sense in the Christian worldview. And the fact that human beings, even on a subconscious level, apparently are able to recognize some of these things, shows that indeed we're made in the image of God. These things all make sense in the Christian worldview.
That's pretty incredible, Dr. Lisle. Now, this next set of questions is going to deal with a very special set of numbers, none other than the Mandelbrot set. In an article you wrote called Fractals, Hidden Beauty Revealed in Mathematics, you said, "Did you know that amazing, beautiful shapes have been built into numbers? Believe it or not, numbers like 1, 2, 3, etc. contain a secret code, a hidden beauty embedded within them. Numbers have existed from the beginning of creation, yet researchers have only recently discovered the hidden shapes that the Lord placed within them. Such beauty defies a secular explanation, but confirms biblical creation. A few decades ago, researchers discovered a very strange and interesting set called the Mandelbrot Set." Dr. Lisle, what is the Mandelbrot Set?
Okay, well, a set of numbers is any group of numbers that has a certain trait in common. So you can talk about the set of even numbers. 2, 4, and 6 would be in that set. 1, 3, and 5 would not be in that set. Now, that one's easy. You can tell by looking at a number whether or not it belongs to the set of even numbers, because you look at the last digit, and if it's 0, 2, 4, 6, or 8, it belongs. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. So that's easy. The Mandelbrot set is a set of numbers that's defined by this little formula such that you can't immediately guess just by looking at a number whether or not it belongs to the Mandelbrot set. You got to run it through this little formula. Formula is very simple. It's z squared plus c. Z squared plus c. Now, c is the number that you're evaluating to see if it belongs to the Mandelbrot set. So let's say if I wanted to find, if I want to see if the number 1 belongs to the Mandelbrot set, I would then it would be z squared plus 1. That would be the number I'm evaluating. Z is another number that starts as 0. So z, you have 0 squared plus 1. That equals 1. And then the number you get, you put it back in as the new value of z. So now I have 1 squared, which is 1, plus 1 is 2. I put that back in, 2 squared, 4 plus 1 is 5, and so on. You do that forever, and you get the sequence of numbers that result, okay? Now, either that's, one of two things will happen. Either that sequence will get really, really big, or it won't. Those are the two possibilities. And if it gets really, really big, then the number you tested, in this case, the number 1, is not part of the Mandelbrot set. And you can see that with the number 1, that'll happen because that number just gets bigger and bigger. So we just proved that the number 1 is not part of the Mandelbrot set. If you do it again for 0, you'd find that the number remains 0 all the time. So it remains small. So the number 0 is part of the Mandelbrot set. So that's how you test it. And the Mandelbrot, one other complication, the Mandelbrot set also includes the so-called complex or imaginary numbers. Now, I hate that term because imaginary makes it sound like they're made up or they're not real. It's just a term. It refers to numbers that when you square them, you get a negative. So the imaginary number I, which is kind of like the number 1, but it's imaginary. When you square it, you get the number -1. I times I equals -1. And that confuses people. How can you have a number that's not positive, it's not negative? When you square it, you get a negative. But it's just most people don't have experienced that, so it feels a little unnatural. They do exist. Even though they're called imaginary, and to add insult to injury, the other numbers are called real. But again, that's just a name. They all exist. They all exist in the mind of God, and therefore they have reality in that sense. It's just most people never get a lot of exposure to imaginary numbers. It's kind of like when you're a little kid. The first time you're exposed to a negative number, it probably bothers you. You'd say, well, how can something be less than nothing? That doesn't make any sense. But then when you get a little older, you get a bank account and you suddenly realize, yeah, negative numbers make a lot of sense. I can have less than nothing. I understand that. So it's the same way with the so-called imaginary numbers. And a good way to visualize them is if you have the so-called real numbers, positives and negatives on a number line like that. So you got, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, -1, 0, -1, -2. The imaginary numbers, you can picture them as being this way. I, 2i, 3i, 4i, -I, -2i, -3i, and so on. And you can see that they're not positive. They're not on one side of 0. They're not negative. They're not on the other side of 0, but they're not 0 either. So they're on a different axis. And you can also have numbers that are called complex, where they have a real part and an imaginary part. So they're kind of off axis. They're up here. And usually the x-coordinate is taken to be the so-called real component, and the y-coordinate is the so-called imaginary component. That's fine. Anyway, the Mandelbrot set contains some of those complex numbers. And the really cool thing is, in the 1980s, computers started to get fast enough that we could start making plots of the Mandelbrot set using all the numbers in this two-dimensional, what's called an argand plane. And the shape that they got was remarkable. It looks a little bit like a horseshoe crab, but with these circles growing off to the side. It's really strange and quite beautiful. And then they started shading it. Basically, this is a map of which numbers belong to the Mandelbrot set. Black means they do belong, and usually they assign some other color, meaning they don't belong to that Mandelbrot set. And the shape is remarkable. It's got some interesting mathematical properties, but the really cool thing is, if you zoom in on it, you find incredible beauty. You start seeing these incredible, intricate spirals, and nobody was expecting that. It's beauty that's been built into numbers by God, the mind responsible for numbers, such that when you run them through this little formula and you make a map of it, you get an incredibly beautiful shape. It's absolutely wonderful. And if you think about it, that shape has always existed in numbers. It's always been there. Anybody could have theoretically plotted it. It's just incredibly tedious to plot it by hand. But it wasn't until the 1980s that computers were fast enough to do this within a human lifetime, or within a few hours in some cases. And they can make these plots, and it's absolutely wonderful. And I do a presentation on this called The Secret Code of Creation, where I show people some of these shapes, and we zoom in on them, and it's unbelievably beautiful. It really is. And it shows you that God is his mind's not only mathematical, but he understands, he appreciates beauty as well. And the fact that we can appreciate that is because we're made in God's image. So beauty built into numbers by God himself. It's awesome. Really interesting.
Wow. So the Mandelbrot set, it sounds and it looks very beautiful. That reminds me of something that you said in a PureFlix interview called Answering Atheists with Dr. Jason Lisle. Speaking of the Mandelbrot set, you said, when you zoom in on this shape, it's unbelievably beautiful, and you get these incredible and intricately beautiful patterns. It's artwork of God, built into numbers. It's existed since creation, and yet it was only discovered in the 1980s when computers were fast enough to be able to see it. Dr. Lisle, how would you answer the skeptical charge that the computer was what really makes the Mandelbrot set, and you're just merely attributing this beauty to God?
Okay. Well, because it can't really be the computer that's making the beauty, because all the computer is doing, the computer is discovering it. All the computer is doing is running these numbers through the established laws of mathematics. You could plot the Mandelbrot set by hand. You could go out with, and you could run that number through by algebraically. It would be incredibly tedious, but you could do it. The shape's always been, that's the shape that will result. Doesn't matter what computer you use, doesn't matter. See, all the computer's doing is doing something that you could do, but it does it thousands of times faster than you can do it. That's all it's doing. It's running the numbers through that formula. But the computer has no choice in the shape that results. The shape is determined by numbers and the laws of mathematics. And so it can't be the computer that's creating it. The computer's just following the laws of mathematics, which is why it doesn't matter what computer does it or what language you write it in. I've written a little fractal grapher. I get the same shape as everybody else because it's following the laws of mathematics. So the shape is not determined by the computer. The shape is determined by the formula, numbers, and the laws of mathematics. That's it. And so it's not something that human beings could have invented either, because we were surprised when this shape was discovered. Nobody was thinking, you know what, I'm going to design this infinitely, and it is infinitely complex. You can zoom in on the Mandelbrot set forever, and it continues to show beauty and intricacy. It's got baby versions of it built into itself. It's remarkable. Nobody sat down and said, I'm going to draw this shape, then I'm going to draw an infinite number of them built into it. Well, human beings can't do that. We don't have that capacity. This has to have been the result of a mind that's infinite. A mind that can think infinitely, and that limits it to the biblical God. The God is sovereign over all reality, all mathematical truth, all physical reality. So it can't be a computer, can't be human beings. It's got to be God.
Wow. Dr. Lisle, we've now come to our final question. In your presentation, The Secret Code of Creation, you said, every astronomer I've ever met assumes that the laws of math work in the distant universe as it does here. And I would argue that makes sense in the Christian worldview because God is sovereign over the Andromeda Galaxy just as he is sovereign over the earth. Dr. Lisle, for someone who's going to listen to this podcast and maybe they're feeling the conviction of the Holy Spirit, what would you say is the take-home gospel message, if you will, of the Mandelbrot Set?
Okay, well, the Mandelbrot Set, what it does is it's evidence, it confirms the existence of the God of the Bible. The Mandelbrot Set itself is not a gospel message, but it confirms that the God who wrote the Bible and who wrote the gospel message into his Bible is real. Because only that worldview, only the Christian worldview can make sense of things like the Mandelbrot Set. And I realize in a brief podcast like this, it's tough to close up all those loopholes. I have recently written a book on this topic. It'll come out in April, actually, on the Mandelbrot Set. It's got a lot of beautiful pictures. And my prayer is that people will read it and realize that God is exactly what the Bible claims he is. He is who the Bible says he is. And that God is a God that we've offended by our sin, because that God is holy. He's perfect. And we have sinned against him. We've rebelled against him. We deserve death because we've committed high treason against the King of Kings. That's a capital punishment. And because we've sinned against an infinite God, we deserve an infinite punishment. And that's very sad. But the good news is that God himself has offered to pay our penalty. And he did that that's the whole point of the cross. That's the whole point of God becoming man in Jesus Christ. He becomes man so he can represent us. He's got our nature, but he's also God, so he can pay an infinite penalty on the cross. That's the gospel message, is that by trusting in Christ to pay for our sins, we can be saved. We can be reconciled with God. We repent of our wrongdoing. That's the gospel message. I think things like the Mandelbrot Set confirm that the God of the Bible, who offers us this salvation freely, who's paid the penalty for us, he really is who he claims to be. It's a demonstration of the truth of the Christian worldview. And so I'm hoping that when this book comes out, people will be attracted. It's like a coffee table style book. People will be attracted to the beautiful pictures. Who drew these? God drew them, because only God could. They're infinite. You can zoom in on these forever. And I hope people say, I want to get to know that God. And I pray that many people will be saved as a result of that. Of course, ultimately, it's the Holy Spirit that persuades, but God uses our arguments sometimes as part of the means by which he draws people to himself. So that's my prayer for the book. And I hope that people watching this will get it when it comes out, hopefully in April.
Amen. Dr. Lisle, thank you very much for your time. It was an absolute joy. And to our listeners, thank you very much for taking the time to learn with us on current topics in science, where scientific discoveries are examined in light of the origins issue. Please share and subscribe to the Current Topics in Science podcast. It's available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcast, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. You can find Dr. Lisle's website, his YouTube channel, his books, his DVDs, his biography, and his scientific research in the links in the description below. Thanks again for listening, and remember, the truth saves.